I hadn't seen James in nearly 5 years. Last time was right after we got back from Vietnam, when we were both just trying to make sense of being alive after so many of our brothers didn't make it. The war had left its mark on both of us, though you wouldn't know it to look at James. He carried it better, or at least hid it better. For me, the reminders were constant, especially with my lungs burned up from that damn chemical attack. Every breath was a little harder than it used to be, like trying to pull air through a damp cloth. It was the summer of 1972 when I ended up in Deming, New Mexico. The doctors at the VA hospital in El Paso had sent me down here to this small military treatment center in the desert for some experimental therapy. They said it might help with the lung damage, but I wasn't holding my breath. Not that I could hold it for long anyway. Still, I was desperate enough to try anything. James had been sent to the same facility. He'd been exposed to the same chemical, and though it hadn't hit him as bad as it had me, he wasn't what you'd call healthy either. The doctors didn't know what to do with guys like us, and the treatments felt more like science experiments than medicine. But what choice did we have? So there we were, two broken-down veterans in the middle of nowhere, waiting for something, anything, that might make us feel whole again. When I first saw James again, sitting in the corner of that dingy little bar near the hospital, it was like seeing a ghost. He was older, sure, but there was still that spark in his eyes, that defiant energy that had always kept him going in the jungle. We hugged like brothers, neither of us saying much at first. Some things don't need words. We just sat there, beers in hand, letting the silence between us speak for all the memories we didn't want to drag up. After a few drinks, we got to talking. Mostly about nothing. How the town was too quiet, how the heat sucked the life out of you, how the treatments felt like a waste of time. But soon enough, we started slipping back into the old stories. The firefights, the endless rain, the buddies who didn't make it home. I could see the weight of it all still hanging over James, just like it hung over me. There was no leaving that behind. It was on one of those nights, maybe our third or fourth time out at the bar, that James introduced me to Ethan. He was Navajo, tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had seen its own share of hard years. Ethan wasn't a veteran, but he had that same quiet intensity about him. The three of us sat at a sticky table in the back, trading stories over cheap beer. Ethan didn't say much at first, but when he did, it was clear he had something on his mind. He started talking about Navajo traditions, about rituals, and the old ways that most people around here didn't pay attention to anymore. At first, I figured it was just local folklore, interesting enough, but not something I put much stock in. But James, he listened like he already knew what Ethan was talking about. When Ethan mentioned a certain ritual that could heal the spirit, James's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "You ever heard of skinwalkers?" Ethan asked, his voice low, like he was telling a secret. The word sent a chill down my spine, though I didn't know why. I'd heard the term before, back when we were stationed near some reservations, but I never thought much of it. Just another ghost story, like the ones my grandma used to tell. James leaned in closer, nodding. "My grandma used to tell me about them," he said. "She said they were shapeshifters, men who could turn into animals by wearing their skins. But they were evil, people feared them." Ethan just smiled a little, a knowing smile. "They're more than just stories," he said. "There are things out here in the desert, things older than any of us. Some people, they can tap into that power, but it comes at a cost." I didn't like where the conversation was going. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but there was something in Ethan's eyes that made me uneasy. I wanted to change the subject, but James was hooked. He leaned in closer, asking more questions, digging deeper into the lore. Ethan didn't hold back. He told us about a ritual, one that his people used to perform in secret, a way to call on the power of the skinwalker for protection or healing. I tried to laugh it off, but James wasn't laughing. He was deadly serious. I could see it in his face. He wanted to believe, maybe needed to believe, that there was something out there that could make sense of everything we'd been through, something that could fix what was broken inside us. Before the night was over, Ethan invited us to witness the ritual. He said it wasn't something you could just ask for. You had to be invited. It was deep in the desert, far from prying eyes. "You'll see things you can't explain," he said, "but you'll leave different, maybe healed, maybe not, but different." I didn't want any part of it. I didn't believe in any of that, and the thought of going out into the middle of nowhere for some secret ritual didn't sit right with me. But James, he was all in. He looked at me like this was it, our one shot at fixing everything that had gone wrong since the war. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe there were things out there we didn't understand, things that could help us in ways medicine couldn't. Against my better judgment, I told him I'd go. The desert was calling, and whether it was superstition or desperation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a line we couldn't come back from. We left for the desert a little after sundown, the heat still lingering in the air but cooling fast as night settled in. Deming was quiet as we drove through the town's dusty streets, past shuttered stores and darkened homes, until we hit the highway that stretched out into the empty wilderness. The further we got from town, the more the sky opened up, revealing a thick blanket of stars overhead. But it wasn't the kind of peaceful night that makes you feel at ease. The desert had a way of making you feel small, like you didn't belong. And the silence out there was heavy, pressing in on the car as if it knew what we were driving toward. Ethan didn't say much as he drove. James was in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, and I was in the back, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me since we agreed to this. There was no turning back now, though. The headlights cut through the darkness, the road narrowing as we went deeper into the desert. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes, Ethan turned off the main road onto a dirt path, the car bouncing over the uneven ground. The bonfire came into view after another few minutes, a flicker of light in the distance that grew brighter as we approached. We pulled up to a small clearing, the fire casting long shadows against the surrounding rocks. There were only a few other people there, no more than 5 or 6, all standing around the fire in silence. They barely looked at us as we got out of the car. The air smelled like sage and something else, something sharper that I couldn't place. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep it together, telling myself this was just some strange cultural experience and nothing more. James, on the other hand, looked almost eager as he stepped out of the car, like he was ready for whatever was about to happen. We hadn't been there more than a few minutes when a man emerged from the shadows, carrying a shotgun slung over his shoulder. He was older, his face weathered from years in the desert sun, and his eyes held the same quiet intensity as Ethan's. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at each of us in turn, sizing us up. Then he nodded to Ethan, who whispered something to him in Navajo. The man glanced at James and me again, his gaze lingering on James a little longer before he finally stepped aside, letting us pass. As we walked toward the bonfire, I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine despite the heat. There was something unnatural about the way the flames flickered, casting shadows that didn't quite match the movements of the people around the fire. The others had their backs to us, but I could feel their eyes on us even though they weren't looking. It was like we were trespassing on something sacred, something we weren't meant to see. Ethan led us closer to the fire, and as we stood in its glow, the chanting began. Low and rhythmic, the voices seemed to come from all around us, though I couldn't see anyone's lips moving. The sound filled the air, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. My lungs, already damaged, felt like they were tightening with every breath I took. I glanced at James, expecting him to look as unnerved as I felt, but he seemed calm, focused. It was like he was waiting for something, something he believed in more than I could understand. Ethan stepped forward then, his face illuminated by the fire, and I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked different. His features were sharper, his expression harder, almost like he was someone else entirely. He raised his arms, and the chanting grew louder, the rhythm faster. I wanted to move to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. All I could do was watch as the flames danced higher, twisting and writhing like they had a life of their own. And then it happened. Ethan's body began to change. At first, it was subtle, a twitch in his limbs, a slight shifting of his features. But then, before my eyes, his bones seemed to stretch, his skin pulling taut as his form twisted into something unnatural. His arms elongated, his hands becoming clawed, and his face contorted into a snout more animal than human. My mind couldn't make sense of it, couldn't accept what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. Ethan was becoming something else, something monstrous. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it wouldn't come. My heart raced, my chest tight with fear, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. This wasn't possible. People didn't just change like that. It had to be some kind of trick, something we were imagining. But the terror on James's face told me he was seeing it too. We weren't imagining this, Ethan, or whatever he had become, let out a low, guttural growl, his new form towering over us, the fire reflecting off his now gleaming eyes. The chanting stopped suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence that made the moment even more unbearable. I could barely breathe. my lungs straining as if the air itself had thickened around us. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. We were trapped, paralyzed by the horror of what we were witnessing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the transformation stopped. Ethan, or the creature he had become, turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fire's light. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating, until finally the others around the fire began to move again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what I had just seen. James looked as shaken as I felt, his eyes wide with disbelief. There was no way to explain it, no rational explanation that could make sense of what we had just witnessed. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever that was, it wasn't something we were supposed to see. The drive back to Deming was a blur. None of us spoke, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. I kept replaying the scene in my head, over and over, but it didn't make any more sense the second or third time. Ethan had transformed into something impossible, something out of the darkest Navajo legends. And I had been there to see it, but seeing wasn't the same as understanding. And after that night, nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan disappeared after that night in the desert. The following morning, James and I woke up still reeling from what we had seen, though neither of us had the courage to say much about it. The memory of Ethan's transformation was burned into my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw him twisting into that monstrous figure, his body no longer human. We didn't talk about it, as if keeping quiet could somehow make it less real. But the silence wasn't enough to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I tried to go about my routine, heading to the hospital for another round of experimental treatments that didn't seem to be doing much. James was the same, quiet, withdrawn, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for words. Every time I looked at him, I could see that night reflected in his eyes, but neither of us could bring ourselves to confront it. After 2 days without any sign of Ethan, we started to worry. James called a few people he knew, trying to track him down, but no one had seen or heard from him since the night of the ritual. That eerie feeling settled in my gut again, the same one I felt standing in front of that fire. I couldn't shake the thought that something unnatural was at work, that Ethan hadn't just walked away from us that night. He had become something else, something dangerous. But the rational part of my brain fought to make sense of it all, to find an explanation that wasn't rooted in folklore and fear. Then we got the news that Ethan's body had been found. I remember the phone call, James's face going pale as he spoke with someone on the other end. His hand shook as he set the receiver down, and when he finally turned to me, I knew. Ethan was dead. They found him just outside of town, in a ditch along the side of the road, his body mangled almost beyond recognition. The police said it was a wild animal attack, maybe a coyote or a mountain lion. But James and I knew better. The details didn't add up. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate, and there was something else, something no one could explain. People had reported seeing a deer running near the road the night Ethan died, but not just any deer. This one moved strangely, almost like it wasn't a deer at all. I wanted to dismiss it, wanted to cling to the idea that this was just a horrible accident, that the desert had claimed Ethan in some ordinary, tragic way. But nothing about this was ordinary. We'd seen him change that night, become something I couldn't even describe. And now he was dead, his body torn apart as if something had come for him. Something that wasn't human. James didn't handle it well. He stopped going to the hospital for treatments, stopped talking to me about anything other than Ethan. He spent his days poring over Navajo legends, digging through stories about skinwalkers, trying to find some kind of answer. It was like he couldn't rest until he understood what had happened, until he knew for certain whether Ethan had become one of those creatures, or if something else had killed him. For me, it was harder to accept. My mind still fought against the supernatural explanation, clinging to logic, to the world I knew before the desert. But the evidence was stacking up against me. Ethan's death, the transformation we had witnessed, it all pointed to something I didn't want to believe in. And the more I thought about it, the more the fear started to creep in, seeping into my thoughts until I couldn't ignore it any longer. The thing that stuck with me the most was the idea of the deer. The way people talked about it, like they had seen something out of place, something unnatural. In Navajo legend, skinwalkers could take on the form of animals, but they weren't perfect. They always carried a trace of their human selves, something that gave them away. And the more I heard about that deer, the more convinced I became that Ethan hadn't died as a man. James grew obsessed with the idea. He kept saying that Ethan's transformation hadn't been complete, that he'd tried to become something else, what hadn't fully crossed over. That's why he was killed, James said. He was caught between two worlds, unable to survive in either. I didn't know if I believed him, but it was hard to argue when every day brought more questions and fewer answers. I started noticing changes in James too. He was more paranoid, more withdrawn, like he was scared of something he couldn't name. He'd talk about hearing noises outside his window at night, strange sounds in the distance when he was out walking in the desert. At first, I thought it was just the stress, the trauma of losing Ethan, but it got worse. He became convinced that whatever had killed Ethan was coming for him next. We never talked about the ritual anymore, at least not directly, but it hovered between us, an unspoken weight. I could see it in James' eyes every time we sat together in silence, the way his mind was trapped in that moment when Ethan became something else. I wanted to help him, wanted to tell him that it was all in his head, that we were safe, but I couldn't. Not after what we'd seen. Not after what had happened to Ethan. The worst part was that I was starting to feel it too, the sense that something wasn't right, that something was out there watching us. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just paranoia. But the desert had a way of getting under your skin, of making you doubt the things you thought you knew. And after Ethan's death, I didn't know anything for sure anymore. The mystery of Ethan's death hung over us like a shadow, and every day it seemed to grow darker. We were both spiraling, trapped between the past and whatever the hell that ritual had unleashed. And deep down, I knew we couldn't outrun it. After weeks of silence and fear, James came to me one night, eyes wild and hands shaking. He had that look about him, the one I'd seen in the jungle back in Vietnam when things were about to go south. I could tell he'd been drinking, but there was something else in his eyes, a kind of desperation that rattled me. He didn't ask me if I wanted to go. He just told me that we had to go back to the desert. He said it was the only way to get answers, the only way to make sense of what had happened to Ethan. I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed against it. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling of dread since Ethan's death, and the thought of returning to the place where everything had gone wrong was almost unbearable. But James wasn't giving me a choice. He needed this. Maybe it was the guilt of dragging me into this mess in the first place, or maybe it was the brotherhood we shared from our time in the war, but I couldn't turn him down. So we left late that night, the air heavy and still as we drove back out to the desert. It was the same road we'd taken before, but this time the journey felt different. There was no talk of rituals or healing. There was only silence, broken occasionally by the sound of James muttering to himself, words I couldn't quite catch. He kept saying Ethan's name, over and over, like he was trying to summon him back from the dead. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the desert in complete darkness. I didn't like it one bit. The headlights of the car barely cut through the night, and the desert seemed to close in around us. When we finally reached the clearing where the bonfire had been, everything looked different. The fire was long gone, leaving only a ring of scorched earth and a few scattered stones. But the air was the same, thick with an unnatural stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath. We stood there for a while, not speaking, just listening to the emptiness around us. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of the clearing. My lungs felt tight, and I had to remind myself to breathe. James wandered around the old fire pit, kicking at the stones and muttering again. I stayed close to the car, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The desert was vast, but it felt like we were being watched. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again, slowly, deliberately. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I could tell it wasn't human. It moved too fluidly, too naturally, like an animal stalking its prey. My heart raced as I nudged James, pointing toward the shadow. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he barely reacted, like he had been expecting it. "It's him," James whispered, his voice hollow. "It's Ethan." I didn't know what to say. The shape in the distance wasn't Ethan. It couldn't be. But as it moved closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just an animal. It had a presence, something that sent a shiver down my spine. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the ring of stones, and for a moment I thought it was going to come closer. But it stayed there, watching us. "Ethan's trying to tell us something," James said, his voice trembling. He stepped toward the shadow, his hands outstretched like he was trying to reach for it. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. There was no way in hell I was letting him walk into whatever that thing was. He turned to me, eyes wide and wild. We need to follow him. It's the only way. I shook my head, fear twisting in my gut. That's not Ethan, I whispered, but James wasn't listening. He yanked his arm free and started walking toward the shadow. I called after him, but he didn't stop. He was too far gone, lost to whatever madness had gripped him since Ethan's death. I didn't know what to do. My instinct screamed at me to get in the car and leave, to let James chase whatever ghost he thought he was seeing. But I couldn't leave him. Not like this. So against my better judgment, I followed him. We walked into the darkness, leaving the car and the remnants of the fire behind. The shadow stayed just ahead of us, always moving just out of reach. I don't know how long we walked, but it felt like hours. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, and the farther we went, the more the fear gnawed at me. I could barely breathe, my lungs burning as the dry air clawed at them. But James didn't stop, didn't even look back. He was driven by something I couldn't understand. Then, without warning, the shadow disappeared. One moment it was there, leading us deeper into the desert, and the next it was gone. We stood there, alone in the vast emptiness, and for the first time, James seemed to realize what we had done. He turned to me, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with fear. "We shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not safe." Before I could respond, the air around us changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the wind, but then the temperature dropped, and I could feel something moving in the darkness. It wasn't the shadow we had been following. It was something else, something bigger. I heard it before I saw it, the sound of heavy breathing, like an animal lurking just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my hand gripping James' arm again. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking, but it was too late. The thing in the darkness stepped forward, and I could see it clearly now. It was the same creature I had seen Ethan become that night at the ritual, the same twisted, monstrous form that had haunted my nightmares. It stood there, towering over us, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no escaping this. We had come back to the place where it all started, and now we were trapped. James froze, his body rigid with fear, and for a moment I thought he was going to break. But then something shifted in him. He let out a low growl, the sound filled with rage and terror, and lunged at the creature. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He charged into the darkness, his fists swinging wildly, as if he could fight the thing that had destroyed Ethan. But there was no fight. The creature moved too quickly, too fluidly, and in an instant, James was on the ground, writhing in pain. I stood there, frozen in horror, as the creature loomed over him, its claws gleaming in the faint light. I knew I had to do something, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as the thing turned its gaze toward me, its eyes locking onto mine. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The desert was silent again, the air still, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. I ran to James, dropping to my knees beside him. He was alive, but barely. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body shaking with shock. "We shouldn't have come here," he whispered again, his voice weak. "We've made a mistake." I didn't argue. I knew he was right. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back.